Hi, everybody. If you're in your 20s or older, adding qualia senolytic to your diet can play a crucial role in combating the negative aging symptoms. Go to neurohacker.com/Kara for up to 50% off qualia senolytic. As a listener of New Frontiers podcast, use code Kara at checkout for an extra 15% off your first purchase. Hi, everybody. Welcome to New Frontiers in Functional Medicine, where we are interviewing the best minds in functional medicine. And again, as always, today is no exception. I'm really excited to be here chatting with Dr. Greg Kelly. I've known him for years. He is a naturopathic physician. He's the senior director of product development at Neurohacker Collective. He's the author of the book Shapeshift. He was the editor at the Journal of Alternative Medicine Review, which is where I met him. He's been an instructor at the University of Bridgeport and the College of Naturopathic Medicine. He taught classes in advanced clinical nutrition, counseling skills, doctor-patient relationships, and more. He's published hundreds of articles on natural medicine and nutrition, contributed to 3 chapters to the seminal textbook of natural medicine, has more than 30 journal articles indexed on Pubmed. His area of expertise includes nootropics, anti-aging and regenerative medicine, weight management, sleep, and the chronobiology of performance and health. Welcome to New Frontiers, Dr. Kelly.
Oh, I'm delighted to get to talk with you and your listeners today.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you. I became a huge fan of your work, as you know, when you were the editor over at AltMed Review, and I was a peer reviewer and got to actually peer review some of your brilliant content. In fact, you guys, a lot of these are they still available? And I know they're full text, full text.
It was a journal that was started by the original owners of Thorne, the dietary supplement company. And when they sold it, they kept it. And then a couple of years later, for a variety of reasons, they lost interest in keeping the journal alive. So it's still indexed on Pubmed, but the links that used to be there to the full text, I think, have all gone away. But if you just Google Alternative Medicine Review, there's a website where they're all archived.
Okay. So then we'll put that link on the show notes. People cruise over to the show notes. There are actually a couple of really juicy discount codes for Neurohacker Collective and some of their products over there. But also we're going to have a link to some of his articles, or the clearinghouse for articles, and any of the other research that we touch on today. We'll have links there, and also the full transcripts, and we'll have show notes, we'll have summaries, etc. But of course, you know that I was a reviewer and a huge fan of your inulin article. If anybody wants to be an expert in that prebiotic, whose time is still coming, maybe we'll be able to actually just drop that actual PDF in on the show notes page. Just read it, you guys. It's such a great discussion on inulin, and I feel like I'm an expert for Dr. Kelly's education.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a bunch of really good articles we can pop over there. But here you are. So you've had an interesting kind of a storied career in natural medicine space. A lot of us know who you are and have learned from you. But now you've got Neurohacker Collective. And I want you to describe what it is. So you're clearly an expert in longevity medicine. Now you've got Neurohacker Collective, which is it's an extremely interesting concept to me. You guys are doing really interesting work over there. And part of it is this suite of supplements that you've been involved in designing. So first, I want to know your own journey into longevity medicine. I want to hear all about that and how you got to where you are. And then I want to also learn about Neurohacker Collective and, what it is and,
Sure. So I'll do the whirlwind tour of the life of Greg, but it was, so I was at ROTC in university engineering school. So when I get out, do not go directly into the Navy. So my formative years in my say like early through late 20s were as an officer in the U.S. Navy, primarily in Hawaii and San Diego, and on ships for most of that time period. And when I first got to, it was Coronado, California, to do like a brief training before going to my ship, it occurred to me that I had no idea how to eat. I had just always eaten whatever someone put in front of me. Like my mom was a great chef, and then in college, the cafeteria and things like that. And one of the guys that I knew was a gym rat in great shape. And so I just said, please help me, right? I have to shop for myself now, and I don't know what to do. And at the time, he gave me a book, Eat to Win by Elson Haas. It was the high complex carb type of diet that was popular, 84-ish. But when reading that, I realized, okay, wow, I've been maybe not being poisoned, but certainly not being fed impeccably. And so that just got me really interested at a fairly young age in taking better care of myself. So I was the weird officer on the ship that ate things that no one else did, exercised. And so when I eventually got out of the Navy 5.5 years later, and this was somewhat selfishly, decided, okay, I want to even learn more about taking care of myself so that I'm not dependent on the medical system. And in that couple-year journey, I stumbled on some naturopaths in Hawaii, Oahu specifically, and thought, my God, what a cool life these people have. And so went to naturopathic school and was in the first class at what was back then Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine. So I graduated in 96. And in that time period, when I was a student, Thorne, they were called Thorne Research back then, decided to, for the first time ever, have student reps at each of the universities. And I was the one picked to be their original student rep at Southwest. And then they liked what I did. I started to do trade shows for them back as my last year in naturopathic school. And that was great for two reasons. One, I would go to these trade shows like environmental medicine conference or other functional medicine ones and realize, wow, this education at this brand new school isn't too shabby. I've learned some great things that these, doctors in practice are only being taught at these seminars and conferences. But anyway, so I worked full time for them for my first year out. That's when they birthed Alternative Medicine Reviews. So in that early years, I contributed a lot of the articles because we were desperate for outside writers. And I was like, sure, if part of my job is write articles, love to do it. And then I left a year later because I really wanted to practice, and ended up working with Peter Diadamo of blood type fame in Connecticut for the next 3 years, and then transitioning later to my own practice part-time and teaching at the University of Bridgeport. So that kind of got me through the early 2000s. And since then, I've been back and forth either in the supplement world or corporate wellness. And my most recent starting with Neurohacker Collective about 6 years ago as the product developer for them and really the science voice for that brand. And we're best known as Qualia. And very likely in the not too distant future, we'll be changing the branding away from Neurohacker Collective to entirely be Qualia.
Oh, that's interesting. I kind of like it, Neurohacker Collective. I mean, there's a lot of experts involved. I mean, are you a collective? I mean, or are you a traditional company? I mean, you seem different. Whatever's going on over there.
So that was the original idea was Neurohacker. So we were a brain first company, both with our podcast and our original product, Qualia Mind. And the idea was the collective is what I think of as we is smarter than me. There's just brilliant people out there that if we can tap into more of them, like you, as an example, when you were a peer reviewer for AltMed and the other great peer reviewers we had some, some of the biggest names people in the functional medicine community would know were peer reviewers, which helped up level the journal, right? Because often some of the contributions needed significant work. So that's still in place. We still rely heavily on thought leaders and expertise outside of Neurohacker Collective, both for, creating new products, but other things. Because really the goal of the company is to, improve human performance and health. And that's, one of our founders, the way he would describe it is like his example with blogs. There's just a lot of noise out there. We don't want to do something if we can't make the world better. So we don't want to contribute to mediocrity. And the only way to not do that often is by tapping into people that really know a topic.
And you're one of the founders.
No,
Right?
The founders are two brothers, James and Daniel Smachtenberger. Daniel's the more the science person, and then a third friend of theirs. And then I was hired really to be, at the time I thought Daniel's mini me, so to free him up to do other things. I really took over all his roles because he was the original formulator for what became Qualia Mind.
Okay, cool.
And every
Um,
product since would be me. I would have like my fingerprint would
uh,
be the most dominant on the product.
and we'll talk about product design, you know, in the ingredient source that where you're sourcing your ingredients, and yeah, because it's good. Um, and then just the whole longevity focus. I mean, it sounds like it's been sort of a thread through, but you're really planting yourself in the longevity space now.
Yeah, so I don't know what your experience would have been at naturopathic school, but mine was that many of my classmates, actually most of them, were there because they'd had some illness and a naturopathic doctor or something tangential, like a homeopath, had made a big contribution to them getting better. And so I was the weird one. I had never seen a naturopath. I just stumbled into them
Right.
inadvertently, right? And thought they had cool lives. And it was the same when I was teaching at the University of Bridgeport. Most of my students would have had a health issue and kind of came in through that direction. But what drove me from even that young age was always, what does health look like?
Yeah.
And then what do I do to get more of it? And not only get more of it now, but invest in ways that make sure I'm still having it when I'm 70, 80, et cetera. Because my dad passed away from cancer at 68. His dad from cancer early 70s. So at a pretty young age, I looked at my dad. He was very heavy, had, what we would now recognize as sleep apnea and the high blood pressure, the whole, kit and caboodle of things, super hardworking executive, did a crazy commute I would never be willing to do. But at, pretty early age, it's like, well, I so appreciate what he's done to make my life easy. I want a very different outcome in my life. And so being a curious person, it's just always driven me. And there's probably no better area to ask the question, what does health look like, than in aging?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It is. Yeah, you're a rare bird in early naturopathic medicine. You're right. You know, most of us were called to the field because of some kind of a crisis. Like for me, it was kind of a classic chronic fatigue picture. And, traditional medicine had really nothing to offer me. I can just say that it was naturopathic medicine that walked me to health early on in my journey, early on when I was thinking about medical schools, actually, and really tipped it for me. But fabulous. That's such an interesting story. And yeah, of course, studying aging is, I think, the best way to really study the chronic diseases that develop with aging. And you, of all, you're going to define the hallmarks of aging. So maybe we should start with, what aging is, and a definition of it. And then you're particularly interested in something called cellular senescence. And so, let's define that and talk about that. So first, what's aging to you? And, how do we measure and quantify it?
Yeah, so I just think of aging as that progressive deterioration in function as time passes, right? So, it eventually, at least given our current technology, catches up with us all. But we want to do, at least in my opinion, as much as we can to make sure that we have atypical aging compared to normal. I saw that, there'd be different statistics on this, but in general, someone that's 60 in North America would be expected to live till their, early to mid 80s. But at least a third of that time will be in significant decline, right? Maybe in
Yeah.
assisted living. So when I think of, aging, like it's a problem, right? And we all know it, right? Because of our loved ones and other people that we've seen go through things. And so, I don't really get into like, oh, I think we can move the needle and make people live to 180, like Dave Asprey will say, or some of the other longevity aspirants, right? I just think, oh, can we make a difference? And instead of that final third being really,
Yeah.
unenjoyable for people, could we move the needle substantially and make it so maybe it's only a year that's unenjoyable? Like my goal has always been to get as close to the end as possible, getting to live life my way. So when I think of aging, it's that thing that interferes with us getting to live life our way. And when I think of then, what the goal is, it's to cut into that time period. And when I think of then why aging, there's and you would know this, is generally two big camps. There's the aging is damage accumulation camp. There's the programmed aging camp, and they'll often then spin any research into their narrative about why we age. And I think there's aspects of both. I think, as the work you've done shows, there's definitely an aspect of programming to, cause what we think of aging with the epigenetic clocks. And with cellular senescence, that would fit almost more into the damage accumulation, that cells are accumulating damage that's causing tissue and organ dysfunction, and that's then manifesting in many of the issues we have that we think of as aging. So I don't think either group is all right. I think they're both partially right, and there's probably lots
I
more
agree.
we don't know.
Yeah, yeah, we'll be in. Yeah, of course, there's a much more, but I do agree with you. I think that has been my conclusion as well. We're in lockstep with both. There is some sort of a program phenomenon. I mean, obviously, we all developed similarly. We hit, if you're a woman, you're going to hit menopause at a, in a fairly predictable range, et cetera. We all, longest we're going to live generally right now without a Yamanaka cocktail is about 120. So that would be like sort of the programmed breakdown or the evidence for that program piece. But then, yeah, we're inundated with environmental exposures that also wreak havoc. Yeah, so I think both are true. Yeah, okay, so then just take us through, the cellular senescence, maybe just move through the hallmarks in general and what they are, and then cellular senescence specifically.
So I think it was published, I want to say it was 2014 or 15 was the original Hallmarks of Aging. So they identified 9 characteristics that organisms of all types, including primates and humans, share in common as we age. So these were things like telomere attrition, DNA damage. So, but one of those 9 was cellular senescence, so the accumulation of what are called senescent cells. And then at the beginning of 2023, there was a new Hallmarks of Aging, the Expanding Universe paper that added 3 more. So they added macroautophagy, dysbiosis, and chronic inflammation as the 3 new ones. So that there's these suite of things that all organisms tend to have as characteristics as we age, and that some are thought of as more like leading to others. So, certain things would then cause, as an example, telomere attrition could cause a DNA damage response in a cell. So now the cell enacts the cellular senescence program. And then because of that, that contributes to the chronic inflammation. So there's somewhat of a directionality built in to these hallmarks. And of the different ones that there's, an ability to modify, I would think of cellular senescence, at least currently, as being among the more interesting. Telomeres is, always things. I think stem cells, that's another one of the hallmarks. There's a really, there's technologies to try to mitigate that. So cellular senescence, when I first saw the work, it was Mayo Clinic in 2015 that coined a term we'll talk about called senolytic, with 2 compounds. And it was an animal study, so very preclinical, but giving that cocktail of ingredients to older mice made them perform much more like young mice. And it's like, wow, that looks interesting, right? So, and I don't know about you, but periodically, I mean, I get inundated, just like I'm sure you do, like with, oh, this is the new thing, or in the supplement world, every vendor or supplier to brands will be like, oh, my ingredient is fantastic. You need to like read our new study and buy our ingredient and put it in your products. And quite often, I think in terms of statistically significant and clinically meaningful. Like I ideally want both. And what I'll often see is, oh, this was statistically significant for sleep. And instead of, taking 38 minutes for someone to fall asleep, it was 35, like clinically pretty meaningless. Right.
Yeah.
And I often think like, oh, of these new things, what might we care more about 5 or 10, 20 years down the road? And when I first saw these papers published on senolytics, it struck me like, oh, 2030, I bet we're going to be caring a lot more about this than we do now. Where other things I look at, it's like, we might have already moved on from that. So it intrigued me at that time enough that on a couple of my vacations from Neurohacker Collective, I took many articles on cellular senescence and senolytic compounds to read as my over coffee vacation reading.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that was insightful of you. Yeah, to to kind of consider hanging your hat there. So define it, why did cellular senescence grab you so much?
Yeah, so I think so just for the audience, what cellular senescence means, and the way I would just describe this simply, so this is a drastic oversimplification, is that, just like our whole body, cells can be stressed by things. And if stress is manageable and they have the resources, they'll try to adapt and become more resilient. So these are things like, increasing antioxidant defenses, as an example, but all kinds of things, right? To, essentially toughen themselves up. But if stress is more than that, they'll probably take on some damage. And that's where then repair mechanisms, or, autophagy being one that is, buzzword that's thrown out a lot. And autophagy means there's damage to proteins or organelles within cells, but not so much damage that it can't be repaired. So cells are going to try to repair that damage. But if stress is even beyond that, then will create an unrepairable cell. And unrepairable cells ideally should go through what's called apoptosis, which is from a Greek word meaning falling off, in the sense that a leaf or fruit fell off a tree or plant. But cellular senescence is somewhere it's between. It's enough damage that the cell's beyond repairable. So autophagy wouldn't help, or autophagy, we've missed the opportunity for that to be valuable for a senescent cell. But senescent cells in the context of aging are things that have figured out ways to not go through apoptosis. So they linger in tissues and then accumulate over time. And the goal of what eventually has become senolytic is to finally convince them to recapitulate that journey and to go through apoptosis. And so what makes something a senescent cell is that it won't, it's permanent cell cycle arrest, as the way they would describe it. But just think in a more simplified sense, it doesn't make offspring cells anymore. It's intended not to make copies of itself. So that would be one thing. Another would be what are called SASP factors, and that's the senescence-associated secretory phenotype is what it stands for, but they just secrete compounds into the microenvironment around them. And that's one of the reasons that SASP factors is why they're so detrimental to the health of tissues and organs, because it fundamentally shifts the terrain within tissues in unwanted directions. And then the third characteristic of senescent cells is that they can often, through those SASP factors, turn otherwise healthy cells into new senescent cells. So they can kind of create a snowball effect over time. And so because of that, as we would both know, and we're probably taught by the old timers, that health of our tissues is reliant on the health of the cells in those tissues. And as senescent cells accumulate more and more through the aging process, we are just filling tissues with cells that are taking up resources, still using nutrients and other things, but are, instead of contributing to healthy function now, are actually contributing to dysfunction.
What are some of the biomarkers to suggest senolytic burden?
So that's a great question. And it's, there's no one great marker. Yeah. So what, if, people at Bucks Institute or Mayo Clinic were trying to, take a biopsy and look for senescent cells, they would stain it first off. They would look at morphology, so size, things like that. They would look for markers or an enzyme, beta-galactosidase, as an example. They would look for things like P16, P21, those are thought of as senescence markers. But they're going to look at collectively a bunch of those things together before they could pinpoint something being a senescent cell. So it makes it, one, it's really hard to measure. There's no simple blood test we could do at this point that would give an indication of tissue load of senescent cells. It also means that in research, the scientists really need to know what they're doing to do a good job in identifying senescent cell load. And so I guess simply put, there's no one marker that would always show this is a senescent cell versus a non-senescent cell. Things that would indicate senescence can often sometimes be found on otherwise healthy cells. So it's more of a panel of things a scientist would look at.
Yeah, right. Are any of the classic markers that we, can run at a standard laboratory suggestive or perhaps surrogate? Would we see an increased inflammatory burden? Might we see an uptick in CRP, or is it too general to actually capture senescence?
So I think that's still all being investigated. The field is relatively new. So the term senolytic was coined by Mayo scientists in a paper published in 2015. And that really put the field on the map, so to speak. I mean, cellular senescence and, senescent cell accumulation with aging had been known about for a while. And, maybe the most formative study was around 2010 when they genetically modified animals to not create senescent cells and found that they just aged in a much more healthy manner. But it wasn't really until the Mayo scientists found compounds that you could take orally that may help manage senescent cells. So there, i.e., a solution emerged as possible on the map that the field really exploded. And so since then, there's been a lot of smart people trying to figure out ways to, almost have a surrogate to see, is the burden going up or down with things like beta gal in blood, the inflammatory markers, things like that. And the little bit, we've done a few N of one type of tests with a lab called Ginfinity that has a panel they've been trying to develop for that. And we just don't see much of a signal there in the classic inflammatory markers to date. And I think timing is ultimately going to matter. It looks like maybe with beta gal, as an example, that you'd expect that to go down over time, maybe if you were doing things to manage senescent cells. And originally the founder of that lab thought, oh, that's what would happen. We'll do a few cycles of senolytics and we should see beta gal numbers go down. But when we've done it with him, it looks more like, at least acutely in the few days or more after senolytics, that amount goes up, which actually makes sense because now you may be releasing more of that into circulation. So that, like, the timing factor, what to look for, is all still being worked out.
Just define beta gal actually, and why you think it would increase, just for the audience.
Oh, so beta galactosidase is an enzyme that senescent cells, not 100% of them, but much more commonly than other cells, make a lot of that enzyme. And it would be part of those SAS factors that is secreted. And it's an enzyme that would break down other things. So, that SAS panel of things they secrete are, the inflammatory markers that we would all test for, and, cytokines, things like that. So that's why, because it's not 100% specific, but much more, prominent in senescent cells. That's why it was one of the things that's been looked at.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think P16 is available. Maybe only in the research setting, but I did come across a lab making that available in some capacity. Now, there's some, I think that there maybe has been a paper or two looking at senescent cells as actually tending to cancer. I mean, is there any benefit for this? I mean, and I know we have we have an excessive burden, and it's damaging the local environment and, likely the systemic environment as they accumulate. But, I have heard that argument put forth that we don't want to turn it off completely. To speak to that.
Yeah. So this goes back, I think, to the early 2000s. There was a discussion among the experts in the cellular senescence domain whether they should just call all senescent cells the same, senescent cells, or have more specific terminology, because the classic way that cellular senescence was thought to occur was telomere attrition, going back to the Hayflick limit, right? That was the origins of what became termed cellular senescence. But that's just one way a cell can become senescent. A DNA damage response with plenty of telomere length can cause the senescence program to enact. If you do things to a culture, like nutrient deprivation or ionizing radiation or anything else, it would be called premature stress-induced senescence. And so, that's my bias of what causes most cellular senescence is stress, fundamentally, not the telomere attrition. And then classically, it was thought that senescence would only happen on cells that were making copies of themselves, things like neurons or muscle fiber cells, which either are, basically don't create clones of themselves through our lifetime, or would very slowly do that. Because as an example, you'll often hear, like, the average life of a cell is 7 years, which is true, but that average is really distorting what is real. So, some cells turn over within weeks to months, but cells in our heart, maybe it's every 4 decades. Liver cells, it's 1 to 3 years. Muscles, about 15, right? So each tissue has almost its own life cycle of cells. And so I'm kind of getting to your question in a roundabout way.
Sure.
But the general idea was, okay, the reason that cells must do this cellular senescence thing and stop making copies is because they don't want to make damaged copies of themselves, which then could lead to, a worse type of stress cell, which would be potentially cancer cells. And for the listeners, think of, whether it's a senescent cell or a cancer cell or many other types of cells, all collectively, they're stress cells. They're cells that should be targeted either to go through apoptosis, like they've taken enough damage should, or the immune system, because of stress markers on their surface, should find them and eventually gobble them up. So that was, for the long time thought like, oh, this must be why we have senescent cells to prevent that. And the way I think of it now, and so this is, a more simplified story, and as always, things are more complicated in reality, is think of things as transient senescent cells and lingering senescent cells. So, maybe we're 20 and, a cell is really stressed and we don't want it to copy itself. So, it becomes senescent, but it would transiently be found in our tissues, that it would have become senescence on its way to either eventually going through apoptosis or the immune system identifying it and removing it. So transient ones probably are useful for preventing a stress cell from going, into, a replication phase that could lead to something we don't want. That's not the aging context. What we have is what are thought of as lingering senescent cells. So ones that have figured out a way to avoid going through apoptosis. So instead of having that beneficial role, they've now kind of turned the tables, and they can actually make that SAS factor is what that can do is pull in. Ideally, it would, in a transient case, quickly pull in immune cells to clean up the debris, repair the damage, and move on. So classic example, we lift weights, we're 22, maybe we, overdid it. We'll create some transient senescent cells to repair the muscle tissue. When someone's my age, early 60s, we overdo it, we'll create almost an explosion of senescent cells in the muscles. And unlike that young 20-year-old, 25-year-old Greg, that a week later, the senescent cells would be gone. They were transient. You'd still see those weeks and weeks later. They'd linger in the tissue. And those lingering ones are thought now, and there's a lot more research going into that area as potentially contributing to a microenvironment that's that's more conducive to other stress cells proliferating.
That's really interesting. I mean, I can see why this is a topic that you really drilled into. It's fascinating. And there's a lot of room from a functional, from your background training in thinking about it. And I know people want to know the solution, but can we see that? Like, how do you know that you've got a burst if you overdo it at 60 something, that you've got this massive burst of senescent cell activity? That's fascinating.
Yeah, so we only know that because of researchers at, places like Buck Institute and Mayo Clinic that really know what they're doing and have done those scientific experiments, where they'll see that crazy burst and then, they'll just linger indefinitely. And, other studies that have been done in that particular context, usually I would think of it as anabolic resistance is the term you'd see in the studies, with the general idea, think of insulin resistance. Anabolic resistance is the equivalent for anabolic signals to our muscles. So, weight training or, adequate protein. In young animals, they have a great anabolic response to those things. In older animals, older humans, we tend to be resistant to that. So, it's why we often see struggles with maintaining muscle size, strength, and quality in older populations. And so far, these are only animal studies. So, for the audience listening. But what they've found is that a main driver of anabolic resistance is the accumulation of senescent cells, and doing cocktails of senolytic compounds to old animals to remove some of that burden reverses that phenotype, so that the quality of muscle tissue becomes more youngified, for lack of a better way to describe it.
So I want to admit that this just hasn't been an area of intense focus for me. I've been kind of planted in, epigenetics since we published our first paper, and we're continuing to research, in that arena. And there's a lot going on in the space. So I this is this is really interesting, and and new for me to hear. I mean, it makes sense that the the publications, the research that you're doing has focused on a physical response to your senolytic agents. I've got a ton of questions here. I mean, but I want to talk about the intervention. So I think that just knowing my audience, there's two lines of thinking. There's one, what do we do about this accumulated senescent cell burden? What do we do? So we want to talk about senolytics. We want to talk about your specific senolytic product, maybe some of the the drug senolytic combinations. Like we want to talk about interventions, but there's this other line of question going on in my head, and probably some of the listeners around, well, what would an appropriate exercise prescription be, and what else are we seeing that prompts senescence, wildfires physically, and so how do we think about this from a lifestyle perspective? And then also we need to layer on the intervention. So maybe both of those buckets you can speak to.
Yeah. So the way I would think about it is, as with the passing of time, inevitably all of us will accumulate more senescent cells, both because of a programmed aging aspect. It just seems like our genes are modified in a way that makes it more likely they'll proliferate. To the immune system as we get older tends to not be so great at detecting stress cells, right? Immunosenescence is what that's often referred to.
And what you said in the beginning is one, senescent cell begets another. So that environment just becomes ripe for the development.
Right. And so that's part of the reason they're often thought of as zombie cells, is because, they won't die and they make new versions of themselves from otherwise healthy cells. And so it'll vary person to person, and even in the same person, tissue to tissue. But we can pretty much bank at my age 62 that I have more than I would have at 50 if I'm not doing things and the way I would describe it, prune them away, right? So like a plant and I like the plant metaphor because of apoptosis, right? It comes from that, like, leaves, fruits falling off a tree. Like a good gardener will see yellow leaves and prune them away periodically. But if they don't, yellowing leaves beget more yellowing leaves, and eventually the whole plant will suffer. So I think of senescent cells like that, like the yellowing leaves that, if we're not careful, accrue more and more over time, and senolytics as the gardener that would periodically come in and prune off the unhealthy leaves. And then in terms of how it manifests, really almost any issue that our listeners can think of that's more common in aging has been linked to accumulation of senescent cells. And by that, I don't mean it's the sole cause, but it's certainly a contributing factor for most of these things, whether it's a performance area or, goes into more of a medical issue. And then the types of cells that can become senescent, as I mentioned, it used to be thought, well, only, cells that are dividing cells would, but now it's, at least fairly well established that, even non-dividing cells may become senescent for, again, that would be completely independent of the reason to stop, them from proliferating. And the areas that, we've chosen to look most at is joint health. And so the original types of cells that were thought to be most prone to becoming senescent were fibroblasts, or connective tissue cells. So think joints, skin, those types of things. Endothelial cells, so think our vessels, and then immune cells. So you can pretty comfortably think of any aging related thing you're thinking about that those types of cells are involved with, senescent cells are likely contributing fairly robustly to it.
Have you altered any of your lifestyle habits since you were 50?
So
thinking about stem cells, thinking about senescent cells.
So so you had actually, that's a good reminder of something you were getting at that I didn't answer. So something like exercise would be like exercise done smartly, not running a marathon every week, would help to slow the accumulation of senescent cells. So it's more preventive, if that makes sense. There's really no evidence that I'm aware of that it would help remove it. And it's tissue specific. So if you're, the exercising muscle tissues would more slowly accumulate, but it might mean stress cells in other tissues, if there was another source of stress, may be accumulating. So for me, getting back to your question, I think, calorie restriction is likely, a significant slower of it.
Mhm.
And, really, I would then, those are the things that have been studied. But the things that you and I would do with clients we're working with, or the things you did in your studies to help people, slow or reverse their biological age, my guess would be those things eventually will be found also to slow the rate of accumulation of senescent cells, just because they're good things. And stress, I believe, is the main culprit in driving maybe the initial insults that cause cells to become senescent.
Well, and it's an elegant sort of example that you're putting forward of the interconnectedness of all of the hallmarks.
Yeah.
We can think about inflammation and cellular senescence, and then it makes me think about our intervention definitely, is very heavy in altering the microbiome, and that's, of course, dysbiosis being now appropriately a recognized hallmark. And then all of this influencing the epigenome, the caloric restriction having similar beneficial effects in the epigenome as well. So yeah, there's just a very interconnectedness.
Yeah, I didn't mention mitochondrial dysfunction as one of the original
Right.
9 hallmarks,
Right.
but that was one of the original things known to cause cellular senescence, right? And we all know that there's lots of, things that contribute to mitochondrial dysfunction in our patients and with aging.
Yeah.
So, and then getting to like, what have I done differently? So the big thing I noticed since 50, what was sufficient to keep Greg in good shape at 50 no longer necessarily was at 55. So, but I've been going back to the Navy. I was sleep deprived for, I would say, that entirety of time. And naturopathic school, I was on a 3-year timeline. I did my degree in 3 years because Southwest offered it at the time. And I worked, I was in Navy Reserves 1 weekend a month, but I also, at one point, just to make money, because we weren't eligible for student loans my first year, I worked 3 nights a week, 8 at night till 8 in the morning at a teen shelter. And 2 of those nights, I would just go directly to school from that, and then sleep for a couple-hour nap between classes at the end of the day. So I was pretty crazily sleep deprived in my 20s and 30s. And at some point, like a wake-up call, like, oh, sleep's probably my friend. And so before my 50s, sleep's just been a non-negotiable. But what I've noticed, and you probably see this too, it's just so rare that people sleep well, even at younger ages. So I feel really lucky maybe that I paid attention to it starting early and still sleep well now at 62. And then the other, I would think, I've always been a big advocate of body clock things. So, morning light, evening sunsets are integrated into Greg's life. But a big picture, I haven't really changed much. I've been largely doing, mostly the same healthy things for decades, and I think
Yeah.
that I think of, the behaviors we're coaching people to do as akin to the investments that we might make financially, right? There's some day traders that are trying to make a windfall, in a day or a week. I'm playing the long game and have been for quite a while, and just try to make smart investments in my health, most days.
Oh, that makes so much sense. I love it. Yeah, that's just, yeah, really appreciate it. All right, so let's get to what everybody wants to know, and that is, these senolytic agents, the product that you've put together, maybe the journey on figuring out what the senolytic combinations, some of them are, at a glance, they're not intuitive if to the non-scientist. So let's talk about, you move through some of your longevity thoughts. Now, what do we need to be doing? And when do we start senolytic agents? Like, I mean, I need, I'm thinking about myself. Obviously, it's time for me to be considering one in my stack, like more intentionally. I have some components, but who are we prescribing these to also? So both.
Great. So the original Mayo work, and the way they started is they said, okay, there's these, it's going to called SCAP networks. So senescent cell anti-apoptotic pathways for the people interested in listening. But long story short, these are protein networks within cells that senescent cells use to resist apoptosis. And so Mayo started by looking, okay, what compounds do we know mechanistically would correct these pathways? And then tested those. And the 2 that they originally identified were quercetin, which has been a long-used dietary supplement, and a medication called dasatinib, which is an immunomodulator. And what they found is that in this original study, quercetin was senolytic, as an example, in endothelial cells, but not in adipose tissue. Dasatinib was senolytic in adipose tissue, but not endothelial cells. There was a few other tissues. And that's stacking them together was additive in terms of the senolytic benefits that they had in terms of more broad tissue effect, and having a more impactful effect on the animals. So that was 2015. The next senolytic, at least plant compound that I saw identified was piperlongumine, which is found. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to ask you, I'm sorry, I'm like the geek in me. How the heck did they figure those out? I mean, did they use some, what is it called? Like, the only thing that's coming to mind is like a high throughput some technology. I mean, did they just blast structures of a ton of compounds to see those both? Like,
Well, my sense was, so for like the way just like SCAP networks work, I mean, some of these are nutrient sensing pathways. Some are anti-apoptotic, apoptotic proteins, right? So they just looked at things that were known to impact either those proteins or those nutrient sensing pathways. And then I believe what they did is they just took healthy cells and senescent cells in, cell cultures and applied these compounds to see which ones disrupted, much more preferentially the senescent cells. So, but that wouldn't be my expertise, but I think that's how they approached it, like understanding, what might work from mechanisms, and, there'd be big portfolios of that because those same pathways have been researched in cancer, as an example, and then applying those agents. And then, once they thought, okay, these look like they work in cell culture in vitro, let's now give these to animals and see. So that was the progression. Cool. And then piperlongumine was the next one. That was, I think, 2017. And that's some listeners probably have heard of piperine, which is sometimes used as a bioenhancer, often combined with turmeric. Piperlongumine is a similar alkaloid, but from a different plant. Instead of black pepper, it's from something called long pepper. And so that one was senolytic, but for a different reason than quercetin. It works in a completely different mechanisms. And then the same Mayo Scripps Institute researchers, I think it was 2018 they published it, but they thought, oh, well, quercetin is doing this. Let's try a bunch of other flavonoids and see if others are similar. And what they did, quercetin was one they retested, but what they found at the time was that fisetin was even more versatile and a stronger senolytic than quercetin had been. And that was probably when I got most excited, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, now there's two things that seem like they're working. And in that study, then they actually gave fisetin to the animals and again measured performance in the older animals, and that improved. The other things they noticed in that panel was that something called luteolin and our friend curcumin, which many of us use routinely with clients, were also senolytic, just not quite as robustly as fisetin was. And so what happened in terms of developing the product Qualia Senolytic is we, look, okay, these look like great potential candidates. Is there plant compounds that may mimic some of what dasatinib does, like mechanistically, that we could maybe sub in for that? And the things that eventually, and this was one of my vacation projects that I mentioned over coffee and a glass of wine periodically, was that it looked like milk thistle and soy isoflavones were the two most promising for stacking with these other, like what I think of as the yellow pigmented flavonoids to be complementary. And that eventually led to what's today Qualia Senolytic. And at the time, so this was end of 2019, early 2020, when I'd finished all of like my reading into the area. And the big struggle was how to measure if it's helping, because there was no test. And at the time, I got Ryan Smith from True Diagnostics on the phone and like, well, what about your epigenetic age? Like maybe that would work. He's like, nah, that's not useful for this. And Horvath had actually looked at that in 2015. And like, long story short, cellular senescence and cellular aging in terms of the DNA methylation patterns are just distinct processes. So for a while, we were just stalled. Like, how would we test this to see if it's benefiting people? And eventually, I just, on clinicaltrials.gov, saw that a couple companies that were trying to advance a drug candidate as a senolytic were measuring joint function using Womack scale, which is a pretty widely used thing. I'm like, oh, well, we can do that. And so that was our first study on our product. Before we launched it, we recruited people with various issues with joint performance, did 3 cycles of qualia senolytic. And a cycle is 2 days on and somewhere between 12 days and a month not taking it, and then 2 days on again. So we repeated that 2-day on, 12 days off cycle 3 times, and saw pretty dramatic improvements in Womack scores. And so at that point,
Wow.
thought, oh, this looks, like it's from, the qualia perspective, we like to have products people experience. We want to make sure that, that they're safe, but that they do what they're supposed to do. So we launched it mostly thinking, oh, there'll be some longevity docs, maybe a few functional medicine docs, some weird biohackers that say, oh, like I'd like to take this. And I wanted to take it. So selfishly, I had been pushing the snowball up the hill that we should make this product, even though we probably won't sell very much of it. And the craziest thing, it's sold out in 6 weeks initially when we launched it.
Wow.
And since then, it's we've done a placebo-controlled study where we used Womack again. We also used the RAND SF-36, which is a widely used general health and quality of life questionnaire. And that was complete. The placebo-controlled study was completed in the fall. And what we saw was a statistically significant improvement in joint performance compared to placebo, and overall about a 66% decrease in Womack scores, which what I mentioned earlier, I care about statistically significance, but also like, will the patient or the client notice this difference? And that's a big change in Womack scores in such a brief time.
And you did that cycling structure? I mean, how did you
Yeah.
describe it for that?
So our general recommendation for just, healthy aging and what I do myself is I take the 2 days once a month, typically the first weekend of the month. For that study, just to make sure we got better adherence, we did 3 cycles over about 5 weeks. So we did 2 days on, 12 days off, 2 days on, 12 days off, and then a final 2 days on. So try to condense really like 3 months of taking our general recommendation into 5 weeks. So that's what we did. And that would be probably about the most frequently I would advise someone to do it.
Well, okay. Yeah, go ahead. Finish that thought.
And the idea is, the simplest idea for listeners is if you pruned a plant every day, that would not be such a great idea. You want to prune it periodically, and then give it opportunity for new growth. And so from the get-go, the Mayo scientists had what they termed hit and run dosing, where they would intermittently give these compounds. And a lot of that was driven, I think, because dasatinib is a pretty powerful medication, right? So they didn't want to be inadvertently creating harm. But really, if you think about it, that all we're trying to do is disrupt these SCAP networks temporarily, transiently, really, so that they're normalized and the cells that are exploiting these pro-survival will finally toggle into apoptosis. And so it's not like we're trying to occupy a receptor or give a hormone day in, day out. That's not how it works. And the other thing I think, and this is just my idea, so it could be 100% wrong, is that a lot of the natural compounds, the quercetins, fisitins, are working not as aggressively on the pro and anti-apoptotic proteins. They're working more on the nutrient sensing pathways. And I think like, oh, well, when would Greg's ancestors have had way more fisetin or quercetin in their diet? And quercetin, we all know, oh, it's from onions, but it's really most concentrated in the parts of onions we throw away, the skins, the little root filaments that come off the bottom. Fisetin, you hear strawberries, but you'd have to eat a boatload of strawberries to get a big dose of fisetin. If humans were eating tree bark, as an example, which in famines our ancestors may have, then you'd get a much bigger dose. And so I think I'm a big believer in not only what you do, but what's the signal that you're sending. And I think it's called the Weber-Fleschner law. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm-mm.
So the funny thing, I never learned about it in naturopathic school, but when I was teaching mind-body medicine course at University of Bridgeport, I had found like a psychology textbook and had read through that, and that law was in it. And long story short, our senses aren't designed on quantity. They don't detect a quantity of change. They detect proportions of change. And so the simple story would be, if you and I went into a dark closet and lit one candle, we would notice a big difference. But if we went into a closet that had 99 candles lit and lit one more, we might not notice any difference. right? So one candle on its own is meaningless. It's the proportion of change that matters, right? And cells have receptors that function as their ears and eyes. And so I think if we were to say, as an example, give the same amount of quercetin every day, that's going to create a different cellular response potentially than giving a big dose once or twice a month. Because it's change that matters to drive response for anything that's receptor oriented. But anyways, that would be my bias. And so I think this hit and run approach, even though it was created because of a different reason, is what makes the most sense to me. We want to send a really strong signal to cells, which requires not only senolytic compounds, but a big dose of them in a brief time, and then a vacation from them.
What is the big dose?
So the generally used dose of fisetin that's being currently studied by Mayo and other researchers is 20 milligrams per kilograms. So what we use in our product is 1,400 milligrams. So that would get you in that range for an average-ish weight person. And then we stack that with quercetin. Usually that's given, like the study that we talked about or emailed about before that DrKF had done. They used 500 milligrams in that, which isn't a big dose of quercetin. So it's more like, again, thinking the change in quercetin. We use a more bioavailable quercetin, quercefit is what we use in our particular product. But, somewhere 500 to 1,000 would be the right range for quercetin as an example.
So you and I were dialoguing a little bit about that, that study that was released last year, looking at the dasatinib with quercetin and plus fisetin actually, and looking at DNA methylation changes to this clock specifically. And the outcome wasn't, it wasn't fabulous, but I think you've just answered the question in that you don't anticipate these interventions to really tweak the clocks.
Yeah, so the original study that Horvath co-authored, I think it was 2016 it published, he basically concluded that I have it written down here. I'll give it a second. Oh, so cellular aging is distinct from cellular senescence was for the conclusion. And then a 2021 study looked again at clocks, and their conclusion was cellular senescence, although undoubtedly a major contributor to the aging phenotype, is not associated with epigenetic aging. So for listeners, I would just say, think of these as two completely distinct things. What the current generations of clocks are measuring and cellular senescence aren't necessarily moving in unison. So the study that was just published, but I saw the preprint last August, like you mentioned, they first did a group that did the dasatinib and fisetin. I think it was 50 milligrams of D and 500 of Q once a month for 6 months, and did first, second, third generation clocks, and did several of each actually. And those, like as your listeners would know, those different clocks measure very potentially different things. And they didn't really see any significant effect. And then they followed on by adding, I think it was 500 milligrams of fisetin. So what I would think of as a suboptimal dose of fisetin as a senolytic, and then redid that. And the thing I personally found most interesting, and it wasn't statistically significant, was that fisetin was actually, when fisetin was added in, it was better overall than just the D and Q. And that the third generation clock, so the Dunedin pace of aging, actually slowed a bit when in the fisetin group.
Did it hit significance?
No, it was yeah, it was not even strong enough to be a trend. I think the p-value was like 0.3 something. But that like to me, that's interesting. Okay, like that slowed a little bit. And this is just isn't, they're just not great tools. So Ryan Smith, when the study was completed, but while it was in publication, I emailed because he's been trying to work on a test that would create, and Ryan Smith is the founder of DrKF for listeners, that would be better suited for measuring senescent cell burden. And his comments at the time were, this just isn't a useful tool for it, unfortunately. So but he knew that going really into this study, and it was more proved that to be the case.
Yeah, and they are trying to expand what they're looking at and assess methylation patterns associated with senescent cell burden. Okay, I have a couple of questions on that. I have a handful of questions based on these last comments you've made. How did they pulse the dosing as has been classically, and that you're doing? Okay, they did pulse it.
Yeah. So it was once a month. And they did it spread over 3 days instead of 2, which is not abnormal, right? That's, I think,
Yeah.
part of the reason the fisetin dose was lower. I just think you create a better signal to noise ratio, you do a higher dose and a briefer amount of time. And typically what we've seen with quality senolytic is people tolerate it much better than I would have anticipated originally. We do see occasionally like, some mild GI types of things, but I thought we would see more just because polyphenols, aren't well absorbed. So you are getting more that get to the gut microbiome and, have a effect there. And then maybe one of the more interesting things, and I've just heard this recently, is we've had both our head of customer service and then at least 4 people that have called her as customers have said that they've started menstruating again after several cycles of quality senolytic, which seems really unusual, right? Like it seems like maybe for those particular women, there was something that is causing the reproductive system to act in a more younger way. So we've seen a lot of interesting things with it. And, for listeners, senescent cells impact different people in many different ways. And there's a general thought of think in terms of threshold effect, that it's only when they become, above a certain threshold in a tissue that you'd start to see, noticeable dysfunction or subjective issues. And I know my personal goal is to prune mine away to make sure I stay below that level. So because of that, I don't expect to feel anything per se. But if someone's already having an issue like we see in the people we recruited in our placebo-controlled study, then we generally see in that area improvements.
Have you measured any of the biomarkers we talked about in yourself? Have you tracked them?
I haven't in myself, but we have our head of research at the Neurohacker Collective has done with Ginfinity. They've done some exploratory panels with the whole panel of inflammatory cytokines and beta gal. And we're, I think again, like the timing has been the issue, that what we see in the few days after that, those things tend to slightly go up in the blood. And
It's interesting.
so it's still like, I guess the bottom line, I felt like we were helping him, the owner of Ginfinity, figure out what his test meant, and it wasn't ready yet for us to invest more in it. And I know, like I said, True Diagnostics has been trying to work on this area for, going back at least to 2020, if not before.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic that at some point, all of us will have access to a test that's better suited for measuring, the senescent cell load and, whether senolytics are helping us manage it. And in the meantime, getting back to what I mentioned at the beginning, my journey has been much more about, like how helping people perform better in their daily lives.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that health span, in lockstep with lifespan. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think many of us are in that, are just walking along with you on that. I don't necessarily know that I'm ready to live on Mars forever,
Yeah.
So, if we hit escape velocity, I don't know that I'm like super excited about that, but yeah, health span commensurate with lifespan, I'm all in. So, huge questions. Speaking about speaking about epigenetics, DNA methylation in particular, I mean, we know like these are epinutrients. It's a cocktail of epinutrients. I mean, we know that fisetin and quercetin both, curcumin, incredibly, the soy isoflavones, probably the other compounds, milk thistle, et cetera. I mean, these guys are epinutrients. There are data on them that they influence DNA methylation, the enzymes, and we can see that they do anti-aging things more broadly in the epigenome. So tumor suppressor genes are turned off as we age. They're hypermethylated and inhibited classically, and these compounds turn them back on. I mean, and most of that cell studies, some animal study, but we are getting more human data, including ours, showing that they favorably influence the methylome more broadly. So the clocks are surrogate markers of the aging journey right now. I don't know that we've got a clock actually capturing the aging phenomena itself, the arms of the programmed and the all of that. But certainly as surrogate markers, I think they're important. But it also does mean that they might not capture everything. There's a scientist, Vittorio Sebastiano, out of Stanford, who's been doing cellular rejuvenation using Yamanaka interventions, and he has developed a clock they're using in the laboratory setting. It's not available to us. It's looks at the entire methylome. I mean, the methylome is 30 million CpGs strong. It's massive, where and the tools that we have available to us are huge. What True Diagnostic is doing is massive, but we're still looking at hundreds of thousands versus millions of CpGs. And so his clock does appear to be capturing the rejuvenation process, like the changes in the hallmarks of aging. It seems he may be capturing more information there. So to your point, the current clocks were inadequate to capture it, but more broadly, like if you did an epigenome-wide association study, like if you looked more broadly at the methylome, you might actually, you would be seeing some movement, is my guess. And we know this from human data. We know people who eat a Mediterranean diet or a Mediterranean diet, turned up with additional polyphenols, EWAS, we see epigenetics DNA methylation patterns changing favorably. We're looking at that, EWAS data ourselves. Our study, we clocked the polyphenol intake in a daily, hitting the targets daily in our 8-week intervention. And it's about, 3 grams of polyphenols, which is intense. It kind of dwarfs a standard Mediterranean, for example. Even some of the polyphenol heavy, ours is more, but you're only doing it for 8 weeks. It's a finite amount of time. And we do see methylation changes beyond, the clocks themselves. So I think there's a place for investigation with what you're doing in epigenetics. It would just have, the lens would just have to be a little bit different. It couldn't be so trained on those clocks.
Yeah, and they actually did report on that in the clock paper that looked at D and Q, and D and Q over 6 months. I think there was only 2 methylation sites. Listeners, don't take my like that. But anyways, it was relatively trivial. But when the fisetin was added in, it was like 208 probes changed, with about 50% becoming more hypermethylated and about 50% being less. So that adding the fisetin in really made a huge difference in the CpGs.
Interesting. Yeah. That's really fascinating. In Sebastiano's clock, they showed caloric restriction having a similar influence and they haven't tested a lot of interventions, but they did show caloric restriction having a similar influence, a similar pattern of influence on the methylome as the, the Yamanaka cocktail, interestingly enough. I mean, I think we're collectively headed in the right direction. I mean, to me, it's extremely exciting. Okay, so question or thought number 2 that I want to hear you speak to is that, these botanicals are used all the time in practice. So people are prescribing these. We prescribe turmeric all the time for everyday use. We use high dose quercetin in allergy season for a loading dose. And then, we taper off and do a maintenance dose, but we're not pulsing these interventions, and so is this a problem? We're not pulsing, and anyway, speak to that.
Yeah, so this would be more, my belief. I for a couple of decades now, I got back into circadian rhythms in the late 90s, and then from there, complexity science. And one variant of that is complex adaptive systems, which we clearly are, right? And our cells are, right? So they're constantly adapting. And so again, let's go back to our senses. If we were to hold an image unmoving in front of our eyes, no matter how bright or colorful, it would only be a matter of time, and a fast time, before our brain adapted and stopped seeing it. The same with background noise, right? We'll quickly filter that out. And so, my bias is that we want to play the same game that senses are playing, and senses on cells are receptors, and they're listening for changes to things in their environment. And if something's continuous, then they'll eventually ignore it, right? Like, it's not changing anymore. That's just the rules of the game, so to speak. So like what you'll see on the Qualia brand of products, like Qualia Mind was our original nootropic flagship product. From day one, we've always 5 days on, 2 days off. And what we find is that works. And then what we'll often then tell people, like every 3 months, maybe take a week or 2 weeks off just to reset all the receptors. The other thing that's, I would say common in our industry would be like, oh, well, just take this 2 or 3 times a day. I think that's almost always, maybe not 100% of the time, but more often than not, less good than taking one dose at the best time of the day that matches the optimal circadian timing for that particular intervention, as an example. So my bias has always been, not always, going back to when I was a young man starting out exercise, I was stupid. I went to the gym pretty much every day. So I had the
Right,
lifting down, but not the recovery down.
right,
Like
right, right, right.
we want to do something and recover. And even Prolon, which I'm sure our listeners are familiar with, the Prolon, the Walter Longo's fasting mimicking diet. A lot of the magic from that has to do with the fasting and then the refeeding that
Yes,
follows it.
that's
Right.
exactly
So
right.
I just think in terms of a mental model, I think a good mental model is that, say as an example, using quercetin to manage some type of like joint issue. If you don't take it for a day or two, you're not going to, significantly impact the quality of that person's life. But if you intermittently, take a little bit of time off, doesn't have to be every week, I think you're more likely to get a sustained benefit over more prolonged periods of time.
And you're dosing higher for that period. We should point
Yeah,
that out. You're just going in really, really aggressively and then stopping.
correct.
Um, this is really interesting.
Yeah,
It's just really interesting. I'm excited about what you're doing and the lens that you're looking through to design these products. It's careful. It's really, I mean, I know your source material is really high. And I'm sure there's been as much attention there. I just, I'm so glad that we had this chance to kind of do a drill down onto this focus and just really kind of bring who you are to our listeners. I think they're going to be excited about it. Yeah. Anything else you wanna throw out there?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. One is that, and this goes back to the original work of the Mayo scientists, that something can be a senolytic compound, but that doesn't mean it's senolytic in all tissues, right? So
Mhm.
that's why like you'll see D and Q as the most common stack to date in studies. And certain things like as an example, olive leaf seems like it has a proclivity towards chondrocytes that are senescent. We know quercetin endothelial cells.
Interesting.
So part of the reason you'll see 9 ingredients in quasi-senolytic is because we're trying to cover more tissues because
Yeah.
there's like an additive nature to that. So that'd be one thing. And the other is that something can be senolytic, but that doesn't mean the amount you're taking is going to be senolytic. So I see, there's a couple of senolytic dietary supplements I've seen that will be, like take this once a day, every day for 30 days. Each serving is 100 milligrams of fisetin. That amount of fisetin is unlikely to be senolytic. Even getting away from the hit and run dosing idea. It would be, my mental model would be like, temperature, like 70 degrees isn't the same as a sauna, right? They're going to do completely different things. So those would be the 2 things. Like we designed ours to have multiple ingredients to support more of a whole body impact on managing senescent cells. And then we put in amounts that are meaningful enough to expect to have benefits. And then the last thing I always think of, did a product do what it was supposed to do? Which is one of the reasons that both you and I like to study things and see
Yeah.
in the real world, did this thing that seemed like a good idea actually help people?
Yeah.
So, when you think of quasi-senolytic, I feel like we're the only ones that have done even one of those things, never mind all 3.
That's awesome. And did you just go through the ingredients of it again?
Yeah, sure. So the number one in terms of the dose is the fisetin.
Mhm.
It's 1,400 milligrams in a daily serving, so a big dose. Then quercetin as the quercifit, which is Indina is the supplier of that. It's a very bioavailable quercetin. And then luteolin, which is it's actually very similar structurally to quercetin, but it has maybe a slight more brain activity. So those 3 would be all work somewhat similarly in their mechanisms within cellular nutrient sensing. Then we have piperlongumine, which again, long pepper is the source of that, but you need to get a lot of long pepper to get a reasonable dose of piperlongumine. Then we've got the olive leaf extract and the curcumin, which I think of those as more targeted towards joint and connective tissue as helping to manage senescent cell. And then the last part is what I think of as the stack of milk thistle and the soy isoflavones. So it's those 9 ingredients. Oh, and then I missed one, Senactive, which Senactive is a clinically studied mix of noto ginseng and sweet chestnut rose. That's been shown in a human study to help remove senescent cells after exercise from muscle tissues.
Well, it just sounds like it's a great design, and we didn't go through all the ingredients, so I'm glad that we took the time to do this. And incidentally, just with my clinician hat on, as we head into allergy season, this would probably knock your allergies out too. That's so funny, with the quercetin and fisetin and luteolin, those 3 would have that sort of side benefit if anybody happens to have allergies as well. Well, listen, Dr. Kelly, it was awesome to spend this time with you. Really fun conversation. I think we covered a lot of really good, interesting ground.
I agree. It was wonderful to get to catch up and talk about someone that's such a good listener and, ask such great questions into this area that I think most of us 10 years from now will be like, yeah, we saw this coming. And,
That's awesome. Good for you. Good for all your good work out there. Yeah. Thanks again for joining me on New Frontiers. Hi, everybody. If you're in your 20s or older, adding qualia senolytic to your diet can play a crucial role in combating the negative aging symptoms. Go to neurohacker.com/Kara for up to 50% off qualia senolytic. As a listener of New Frontiers podcast, use code Kara at checkout for an extra 15% off your first purchase.